expectation that life is achieved, not received. So think about that. If you go out and you're going to your work and you're conscious that the spirits could talk to you at any time, they could speak to you through the wind, they could speak to you through the forest, God could speak to you at any occasion, you had a sense that life was coming to you from all sides. And you had to be attentive to what was coming to you, and attentive to these voices, and attentive to the Spirit. And then all that disappeared. But when the spirits were active out there, you were a receiver. You were a radio that was tuned to lots of different channels. So life was something you received. In this relatively short period of time, we went from life being something that you receive to something that you achieve. You accomplish your life. You don't get it from somewhere else. You build it. You become self-made. We accomplish our life. So the emphasis shifted from a sensitivity to what is out there, a sensitivity to listening, to the big emphasis was now on accomplishing. And it also affected how we look at the world. So in the 1500s, it was taken for granted that God was at work in the world. God caused things to happen. God caused storms to take place. God affected the weather. God affected politics. God affected all of those things. That shift from being enchanted and porous to being buffered and cold and empty meant that now history was not something that was in the hands of God. It was something that was accomplished by political activity. When you read the history of the unification of Germany, I remember writing essays about it in school. It was all about, it came about because somebody shot somebody and they did this and they did that. It was all human activity that changed history. And you could date when it happened. You could say that change in history took place on this date caused by this person. It wasn't a divine activity. This shift was, God wasn't creating human history anymore. Human beings were creating human history. Or wars created the changes in politics. So that shift from receiving life from the world around us to achieving life also changed how we looked at human history. Human history now was caused by human beings. It happened on a certain date. You could identify the date that it took place. It was now all achieved by human beings. And all of that, I think, that shift away from that unglued the community. From 1500s, we were all expecting life to come to us from beyond, expecting the spirits to speak to us, expecting God to be active in our life. Once we lost that sense of living in an enchanted world, and now it was all up to us. Now it was up to me to achieve my life. Now it was up to me to create a political party. Now it was up to me to build a business or something like that. It started to unglue the culture. Can you see how that would happen? If we're all receiving, we're kind of all united, but once we start achieving, now we're drifting apart. Now we're starting to be separated from one another. Now it's all up to the individual to achieve what they are supposed to achieve, and I don't need you, and I don't need you, I don't need you, it's all up to me. I could do it on my own. All of that, I think, starts to happen from that shift from 1500 to 2000. That shift away from being porous, where God is present and it's leaking and you can hear and speak out there, to this siloed world. And it kind of unbundled the church. So one time we were all together, we were all united, we were all receiving the same messages, and now we started to receive our own message, accomplish our own future, plan our own life, set our own goals, achieve our own ambitions. So we ended up that was the breakdown into separate bodies, and then mobility, people were able to move more, there was more wealth, people could make more decisions. You can see how that begins to break down the culture, and people become more and more separated from each other, more and more independent, and less dependent on one body being the source of their identity. In the middle of all this, I think there's a change in what is the value of a human life, or what does it mean to live a valued human life. Now, for us who grew up in almost at the end of that era, to be a good human being meant to be a believer, meant to be a Christian, meant to go to church, meant to live a certain way. We're starting to see the beginning of what was called to be an authentic human being. That's a different kind of emphasis, to be authentic, to be true to yourself. I'm not being true to the community anymore because I'm now separate from them. We're all on our own, trying to achieve our life. So I'm not going to be true to you and you, to the collective. Now I'm going to be true to myself. I'm going to be an authentic human being. And guess what? There's now 100 different ways to be an authentic human being. There's not just one anymore. Now there's all kinds of ways of being an authentic human being. And Christianity became one option. You could be an authentic human being as a Christian, but you could also be an authentic human being as other religions, or just as a humanist. You know, I was listening to a TED Talk this weekend, and this man, he is following on foot the migratory movement of the first human beings out of Africa, and his eventual goal is to walk all the way to the tip of South America. He's been walking for 10 years. He figures he's got 7 more years of walking ahead of him. Interesting journey. Very thoughtful man. Now for him, this is for him what it means to be authentic. I'm going to follow the path the first human beings followed out of Africa and how they spread across the world, eventually reaching the tip of South America. Isn't that interesting that someone could take that and make that an authentic human life? So different from the ways in which we were brought up. But along with that shift was the church at one time was the dispenser of religious grace. When we all grew up, that was, if you wanted grace, if you wanted the gifts from God, you received those from church. You went to church. Once this unbundling, this separation starts to happen, now people say, well, I can find what you people call grace somewhere else. I can find it through my friends. I can find it outdoors. I can find it by following this particular speaker that I really like. I have all kinds of other sources that can help me to discover goodness, truth, beauty, joy, all of those sources. And then along with that, we then see all of these religious rituals now being taken out of the church. I can find another way to celebrate our wedding. I can go here and I can have a meaningful celebration on the beach. I can have a meaningful celebration here in the forest. I can have a meaningful celebration here. There's all kinds of ways that I can discover grace in the world, and the church no longer has the monopoly on that. In some ways, it's almost like this generation is trying to come back to that enchanted world that we once lived in, where the spirits were active in the world everywhere, and not just in church, that I can find joy and beauty and grace in other settings. And weddings are the ones that have really changed the most. Not so much yet for funerals. It's really interesting. We don't have a lot of alternative funeral celebrations. We have celebrations of life, maybe, but we haven't had any dramatic changes in how we celebrate death or deal with death. Death has more mystery to it than we can get our hands on. I think death is too big a reality that it's almost like we don't dare tinker with death too much. Marriage is one thing. We don't tinker with death too much. But along with that, the idea about church membership has changed. It used to be you had to believe, you believed everything, you were a member. Being a member meant you were full on, you were in. Now it's kind of, if I feel like I'm belonging, I'll belong, and then I can drop out and drop back in. Sharing even things like watching Mass on TV. It was, the membership of being a church has quite changed quite a bit, I think, now, too. Not just for young people, but even for everybody else. It doesn't have that same sense of obligation. And along with this is an increasing rise of what we might call apatheists. They're not atheists, they're sort of apathetic believers. It doesn't show up on my radar. I don't really care about it. It's just really not important. It's more apatheist than atheistic. Apathy sort of dominates that group. But once you put them aside, we're left with two different groups of folks on this journey: dwellers and seekers. And there's more and more literature being written about those two groups of people. You and I, we're basically dwellers. We're at home in the church, we like the church, we like its organization, we like its rules. We're dwellers. There's that whole other group that are outside of us that we might call seekers. And we're going to try and talk a little bit about who is this group of seekers. So they're not apatheists. It's not they don't care. They tend to use language like spirituality. So they're actually looking for something. So they're not indifferent to God, but they're not dwellers like we are. And one other thing before we go on. Sadly, a lot of seekers, when they disagree with the church, they disagree with the caricature of the church. They don't really know what the church is, but they've created a kind of picture of the church, and that's what they disagree with. It's kind of a caricature of us. They've taken some of our worst moments and assembled them into a picture and painted us all with that brush. It's unfortunate, it's sad, but we have to kind of deal with that because to some extent we gave them enough examples that it wasn't really difficult to build the model, of what, and now that's the picture of church they have, and that they disagree with and they don't like. It's kind of a caricature, but there were enough examples over our history that it wasn't really difficult for them to assemble that picture of what the church looks like. And when they imagine encountering that version of the church, they know they're not welcome. But they're not welcomed by the caricature, right? They painted a picture of the caricature. They know that caricature is critical of them. They know that caricature doesn't agree with what they're doing. They know that caricature is going to give them lectures. So they don't want to have any encounter with that caricature. And if you could separate them from the encounter, they would say, well, I'm just not welcome there. My opinions are not welcome there. Whether they are or not, that's the conclusion they've come to. My ideas, my opinions, are just not welcome by you people. Now, we can say, well, that's not true, but we have to deal with their perception if we want to have an encounter with them, because their perception is their reality. We tend to go and dismiss them and say, well, they're just consumerists, They're just taking whatever they want. Not completely true, because they have an openness to the transcendence, to God, to something beyond, that they can't let go of. And it's that openness to the transcendence that keeps them anchored. So they might look like they have no commitment, they might look like they're very superficial, but they still have this openness to the transcendence. But they do have some reservations about us. And here are some of the probably easy descriptions of this. They're very skeptical of ready-made answers, which they perceive the church to have lots of. Like if something comes up, the church always has an answer to that. What's the truth of that, or what's right or what's wrong about that? They're suspicious of too much assurance. When they hear voices that say, well, it's this way, that's just the way it is. Woof, back up. They're very suspicious of too much assurance. They don't like ponderous structures. When you say to them, well, first you have to do this, then you have to do that, then you do this, then you do that, then you can get married in the church. Not interested in that. They're way more agile in their lifestyle. They move much more quickly than we do. They're used to being able to go here, go there, do this, do that. So they come up against the church, and the church says, well, there's 18 steps you got to go through to get your baby baptized. Not about here. Way too ponderous for them. I want to be able to do this right now. I'm going to right now. So things that are complicated or to them appear to be complicated, they have very little interest in it. Against these seekers, they trigger anxiety in us. And I think that's something we're going to have to find a way to let go of. So as settlers, and I'm going to just refer to all of us as settlers, that when we look at this group of seekers, we worry that the essentials are being lost. We worry that authority is being eroded. We worry about a loss of sanctity, a sense of sacred. We worry that we want to make sure that we have a certain structure. As settlers, we know the value of order. We know that you can't have a really, healthy society unless you have rules, unless you have order. We know all of those things. And so when we encounter seekers, we tend to get anxious, and we get defensive, and we get critical, and then the separation gets wider. Can you see how that happens? So in a sense, we have to be ourselves. We can't simply say, well, let's just throw out order and we'll just cut it all loose. That doesn't work. But we have to find a way to not get anxious and not get defensive and not get worried. God is in charge of all of this. It's not up to me, it's not up to you. We still have to stand for what's important, but we're still going to have to find a way to navigate the relationship. Because the more we get our back up, the more they disappear over the horizon, and we don't have any conversations. So we're going to have to find ways to have conversations without getting defensive, anxious, nervous. And in a sense, we have to find a way to coexist, to be able to, can we do that? And a lot of that, I think, depends on understanding them. So there are still lots of folks, and we see them, I think about them as sort of World Youth Day young people who go to World Youth Day and come back and they're filled with enthusiasm. It's the summertime of faith for them, and it's wonderful. And you think to yourself, that's just great. It's just wonderful. Does it apply to seekers? Nope. Are they going to go to World Youth Day? Nope. Not interested in that. Does it mean that we shouldn't have World Youth Day? Nope. You should still do those things. They're fine. We're just not all going to fit this model. We're not all going to fit together into this one model. So we have to be really careful about saying that's the only model of young adults that's acceptable. If you're not part of World Youth Day, you're not accepted. That's not going to work. World Youth Day is fine for the young people that it services, it works for. We're going to have to find ways, how do we have conversation with the seekers who don't find that attractive, who don't fit into that model? That's going to take some creativity. So who are these seekers and how do we walk with them? Interesting questions. So the biggest group of them are the millennials. It's sort of the 30 to 45-year-olds, but when you think about it, it's slopping down into the 20-year-olds, and it's slopping up into the 50-year-olds, but that's that group. It's somewhere in that millennial group. And to some extent, their emphasis on the human is really healthy. They really think being human is really important, and that's a good value, and it has been really, it's worth respecting and worth listening to. Their views are messy. Often they're not very fully formed, so they might come across as being illogical to us if we're patient enough to listen to them. They have a high stress on being authentic. They tend to reject reality that comes across as binary. You know, male, female, independence, autonomy. They don't live in a binary world. Secular versus sacred. Faith and doubt for seekers coexist perfectly fine. They have no problem with believing some things and doubting other things, whatever it is they're talking about. They believe that there is truth, but they don't believe truth is ever pure. We find that odd, you know? Like, it's either true or false for us. For seekers, they say, no, it's true partly, or it's true sometimes. So it's really interesting for us to try and listen to that without dismissing them by saying to them, well, it's either true or not. No, that's grandma talking, right? That's grandpa talking again. They're saying, well, it is true, but sometimes it's not. No, and for us, that creates great difficulty for us. But for them, they're perfectly comfortable to say, it's true sometimes, but not true other times. One of the things that we grew up with was we were taught truth initially as an idea, and then those are the rules, 10 Commandments, these teaching, and then you applied them to life, right? So the line of transmission was head, heart, hands for us. That was the way it went. Not the way it works for seekers. They don't start here. They don't start with an idea. For them, the priority is experience over ideas, friends over institutions, the community over individuals. They want to have their own journey, ask their own questions, have their own open mind. But it's this exposure to the transcendence that is really interesting about them. One of the images they have, they live in a room that is has a ceiling, but it's got windows in the ceiling for them. There is God beyond their world. God is speaking to them from beyond. They have this sense of transcendence, has not let go of them. So here are some of the characteristics of seekers, and I came across it in some of my readings. First of all, they're unabashed about being secular. They don't need to make a reference to God to make sense of their life. They can make sense of their life without any reference to God at all. Perfectly comfortable, whereas you and I want to know, well, what does God think about that? Does God have an opinion on it? What's right? What's wrong? They're perfectly happy living their life, guiding their life without any reference to God. All beliefs for them are up for debate. There are no beliefs that you can say to them, well, that's not negotiable. Everything's negotiable for them. All beliefs are up for debate. They're conflicted, and this is really an interesting thing for them. You and I would be less comfortable with living a conflicted life, but they're not. So they have lots of tension in their life between faith and doubt, between the individuals being autonomous and I want to belong, that sense about the community and independence, about the fact that the absolute exists, but it doesn't exist in a pure form. Those are real conflicts for them. They can wander about without having to land in one space and say, I'm now here. You know, whereas you and I, we want to have borders. We want to have borders. This is what it means to belong to the church. You know, or this is what it means to belong to this or to do this. They're quite happy wandering into this world and then wandering into that world, and they have no problems with saying, well, I'm partly here. I kind of partly belong here and I partly belong there. That's not a problem for them. They're quite comfortable being able to do that. They have very little interest in our culture wars. I remember talking to a friend of mine about the climate issue, and you could see right away as soon as it came up, he was ramping up to have this conversation. And I asked him, I said, just out of curiosity, do your grandkids ever engage with you in that? He said, no, I can't get them excited about it. And I said, yeah, I know. They're just not interested in those wars, Whatever it is we're fighting about, they're not interested. They'll just wander out of the room, go somewhere else. By and large, those kind of battles, they're not interested. Not interested, doesn't get them excited. They're very experiential based. The priority is on lived experience over the rule. Lived experience over an idea. And they'd rather muddle through. I'll rather just kind of muddle through. I'll try it. If it doesn't work, I'll try something else. But I'm not going to be afraid of making mistakes. For them, identity is not something that's handed to them. So you and I, when we grew up, we actually got a job, and the job was pretty much defined. They're not interested in that very much. They'll work from home, go there, do this, put this job together with that job. They create their identity. They don't receive it as a package. I'm going to assemble this, put this together on my own. Street smarts are more important to them than book smarts. They'd rather enjoy the uncertain twists. Oh, I didn't see that coming, but let's try that out. Let's go there. Some friend of mine, she ended up buying a Christopher medal for her grandson who was on his way to Thailand for an adventure, and she's going, Thailand? What's he going to Thailand for? Well, that's perfectly fine. We're going to go and figure it out and go find a life in Thailand for a while. Not something that you and I would be at all interested in. They're more interested in their story over our worldview. Like, we want to tell the big story of Jesus. They're not interested in the big story of Jesus. They might be interested in a message from Jesus that has some truth to it that you have learned from your personal experience. But don't tell me the big story of Jesus and expect that to have some impact on my life. Not going to happen. Not interested in that. They prefer homemade answers than ready-made solutions, and would rather have deep questions. Find a really good question. They're on a kind of an enlightenment path where understanding happens, and then I'm going to act on it, put it into practice. As I mentioned, they have this hands first, then heart, and then I might distill a truth from my experience that I'm now ready to share with you. I'm now ready to pass on to you. They're very relational. Relationships matter an enormous amount to seekers. Their life is shaped by their relationships, and their relationships tend to go across this way rather than this way. They're horizontal rather than vertical. Hanging out is how they create an identity. That's why we're spending our time with our friends, because in that process, I'm figuring out who I am. That's how I do that. I'm going to do that in the company of my friends. Technology is about connection for them. For us, it's a tool, but for them, it's connection. And selfies are their way of saying, this is how I fit into the world. I'm taking pictures of myself so that I can communicate to my friends how I'm fitting into the world in this particular moment, right here, right now. So all that chat on the phone is all about identity creation. It's all about staying connected. It's all about being formed. And they have this high priority on authenticity. They have a very jaded attitude towards simplistic solutions. And authenticity for them, it can't be claimed, it has to be earned. So I can't say to them, I'm an authentic person. They'll be the judge of that. And they'll make that judgment based on whether they see in me coherence between what I say and what I do. Am I an authentic person? They'll be the judge of that. And it doesn't come about as a result of a role. I'm not authentic because I'm a priest. For my nephews and nieces, that's irrelevant. I'm authentic because I'm Tim, their uncle, and they buy me or they don't buy me. So authenticity doesn't come across because you're a teacher or a priest or whatever. It comes about because of the character of your life. And even business has to be authentic. This is one of the strange phenomena that we're seeing in business. I'm not so sure you're familiar with all the ESG emphasis in business now. Like, companies have to be able to say, what's your environmental policy? What's your sustainability policy? What's your governance policy? Does your governance reflect the diversity in your company? Does it reflect a mix of men and women? Where did that come from? That's this generation insisting that businesses have to be authentic. Prove your authenticity, and don't just put it in writing. Show us you care about the environment. Show us your company is sustainable. Show us that your leadership reflects the diversity of your company and reflects both men and women. All the ESG principles all come from this generation. My generation only cared about, is it making money? All of a sudden, they've got all this ESG stuff. Never had that before. And they're suspicious of anybody that's posing. We have this strange phenomena now of living in a woke world. You've heard that expression? Are you woke? You know, it comes out of the black experience, getting the black people originally to wake up to the reality of their own oppression, but it got hijacked by the culture, and then it became saying the right things, being politically correct about everything, being woke. And in the States, it's so bizarre because in Florida, they campaign down there as Florida is the place where woke goes to die. You know? I mean, we're really anti-woke in Florida. So, but where did woke come from? That's this emphasis on being authentic. Only it's now been appropriated and hijacked and taken somewhere else. If you watch football players after they score a touchdown, they're very unique handshakes. Used to be there was one way to shake somebody's hand. What is that? That's authenticity, you know. And you got to remember that Anna's handshake is different than Eva's, is different than Sandy's, and different than Stephanie's, you know. And Stephanie wants this kind of handshake, and that's all authenticity. That's all unique to the individual. There's nothing common. But they live in this haunted world. For this generation of seekers, they live in a secular world, but it had a nagging sense of incompleteness to it. Open to transcendence, a brass ceiling with skylights is what one of the popular writers describes it. A brass ceiling, but there's skylights in the ceiling because God is still out there, and God is still present to me somehow, even though I'm living outside of the church. They have a kind of an awakened pagan soul, almost an expectant romanticism with a religious longing to it. So how do we respond to them, to this group, if we take that's a reasonable description of what seekers are like? Well, when you think about our pastoral activity over the centuries, we basically had two kind of projects. One was we looked after the settlers. That meant providing mass, sacraments, catechism for everybody. And then we went out and we tried to get converts, right? Those two different things. Look after the people inside, bring people from outside in. Going to have to find a third option, and that is we're going to have to find a way to accompany the seekers without the expectation that they're going to join us. Find a way to walk with them and have conversations without thinking we're converting them. We can't approach seekers as if we're possessors of the truth. They want to be and are going to be authors of their own story. So we're going to have to find a way to listen to that story and see if we can understand it and walk with them. And it's going to require on our part great generosity, a willingness to listen and keep our mouths shut, to listen and not offer our opinions about how wrong they are, and to get out of our grandma and grandpa model and say, we're here to fix you and correct you, and find a way to listen to them. Accompaniment is not about bringing them to where we are, but marveling at the journey. Pope Francis has this image of about Jesus knocking on the door, and when you and I grew up, it was Jesus knocking on the door of our heart to be let in. Remember that image? Kind of pretty common. Pope Francis says now it's Jesus knocking on the door. He's inside the church and he's asking to be let out. Let me out, because I want to go to them too. They're part they're a part of my children as well. Let me out so I can go to them. I can talk to them, and you come with me. So it's a whole different way. And he's pretty forward-looking about that. I think one of the images, and I'm coming to see it more and more, is the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus. You know, they've left Jerusalem behind. They've left the place where all of the truth was contained. They've left the place where the settlers live, and they're out on the road, and they meet this stranger on the road. And the stranger asks, "What are you talking about?" That's the model right there. We want to fast forward to the story and get to where they recognize him in the breaking of the bread, which is wonderful, but we got to look at where it starts. It starts with him joining them on the road. They don't know who he is. They don't recognize him. And what he does is he expresses genuine interest in their experience. What are you talking about as you walk along? And we're going to have to learn how to ask that question. What are you talking about? And then listen, and then learn how to listen. And accept that Jesus goes to everybody, because Jesus is not our property. He does not belong to us. Our God is a pilgrim God who has always been open to others. So here's some of the changes that we probably need to make. We're going to have to, we have to live as dwellers, but we have to find a way to accept that I don't have a corner on the truth. I don't possess all the truth. Maybe there's things I can learn from those who are walking outside the church. And that shift from being open to being open, I think it's going to be one of our biggest challenges. It's going to be really hard for us to accept that maybe I have something to learn from you, and I'm going to have to listen enough until I can finally hear what I need to learn. I think we have to be more truthful about our own struggles, our own experience of conflicts in our faith. We have to be able to tell a truer story. That, is it true that you have never doubted? Is it true that you've never had any struggles? Are there things about the Catholic Church that perplex you, that never bother you? I mean, I think we are going to have to find a way to tell a more honest story about our own journeys. And we need to acknowledge as part of that there's things in the Bible that are really bizarre. We keep saying the Bible is the revealed truth of God, but there's things in the Bible that just don't make any sense. And we shouldn't be afraid to say that. I remember listening to a rabbi. He'd applied for a job as a very prestigious Jewish synagogue in New York, and in the interviewing process they said to the rabbi, "Do you believe that God told Saul to dash the children's heads against the rocks?" It's in the Bible. And the rabbi said, "Well, I think Saul thought God told him to do that. He didn't get the job." In the Jewish world, it's in the Bible. It's exactly what it means. But he said, "I can't believe that God said that." Saul might have thought that, but God didn't say that. But that's what it says in there. So being more honest about things in here that don't make sense, and accepting that the Bible does contain the truths we need for salvation, but there's bizarre stuff in there. We shouldn't be afraid to acknowledge that and have a sense of humor about that. Our pedagogy also needs to change a little bit too. We have to give a priority to experience over ideas. What are you doing? What's happening in your life? You know, what are you coping with? Let's start with that experience and then see how that applies, or how it applies to your faith journey. We have to start with experience rather than concepts and rather than ideas. Keeping that pattern in mind: hands, heart, head, not the way we grew up. Head, heart, hands. They start with hands. They start this way and move up. And accept that there's a priority of belonging over believing. And one of the things we're going to have to struggle to do is we have to find a way to create safe places for them to have a conversation. You know, in the past, our church has instrumentalized friendship. In other words, we're going to make friends with somebody, but everybody knows our real goal is to get you to become a Catholic. That's what I mean by instrumentalizing friendship. Is we're going to reach out to people and I'm going to love you, but Here, have some pizza, but, we got to stop that and say, look, I'm just going to become your friend. I don't know where it's going to go, but stop instrumentalizing friendships and just be ready to accompany and to walk with them. And to recognize that seekers are on a pilgrimage, and we have to honor that pilgrimage, and that there's something authentic about letting them move at their pace, learning from what happens to them along the way, finding better questions to ask about their experience, and accepting that in some ways they're all a little bit like Zacchaeus. And I've come to see that Zacchaeus is such a wonderful model for what the seekers are like in our culture. And you remember the story of Jesus is coming into Jericho, and Zacchaeus climbs up this tree, and then he has this encounter. But just before you think about the encounter, just think about Zacchaeus in the tree. Here he is. He's curious about Jesus, curious maybe about these people who are enthusiastically following him, but he doesn't want to get too close. He doesn't want to be seen. He wants to be able to watch from a distance, to watch from a place of concealment, and learn, watch. It's really interesting. And eventually Jesus says, I'm coming to your house. Notice he doesn't say, come to my house. He says, I'm going to your house. But our world is filled with Zacchaeuses. A lot of them, some of them are in the church. A lot of them are in church. They're here. Not sure why they're here, but they show up at church. A lot of them in our families, our grandchildren. Lots of Zacchaeuses there. Up in the tree, curious. They're not going to expose themselves because, remember, they have this caricature of who we are, and they expect a certain response from us. And so they're going to be very careful about exposing this. And they're waiting to see how we might respond to them. Interesting enough, we need seekers. And one of the reasons I think we need seekers is if we're not welcoming of seekers, we risk becoming a sect. Now think about what a sect is. A sect is a community that has very tight borders. It controls who's in and who's out. It has absolute truth. And you're not allowed to vary from the absolute truth. That's what a sect is. And we actually need the presence of seekers on our edges to protect us from becoming a sect, because they challenge us. They make us ask questions. They make us re-look at our own faith. They make us look a little bit more deeply at what is it you really believe. And do you really believe that, or do you just say that because you're supposed to? So seekers keep us honest. In some ways, I think the church also should give a preferential option to caring for them, too. Over the years, we've learned about giving a preferential option to the poor, that we should give priority to the needs of the poor. Some ways, we should also give a preferential option to the seekers, because we have more to be gained by investing our time and our energy into finding ways to have conversations with them. Because the settlers are going to do okay. We don't need a lot of care. Do we? I don't think so. I mean, we're pretty well solid. Kind of know what we know, and we're pretty... But they're out there, and it's very easy to put all of the church's energy on looking after dwellers and settlers. Pretty easy, because you're low demand, We're all in agreement. We can kind of pat each other on the back, Aren't you good? Aren't you good? So it's really easy to look after settlers. Not so easy to look after seekers. Or to accompany with them, or to spend time with them. I think our church should give preferential option to spending time traveling with the seekers. And to accept that we have to live as missionaries, not seeking to convert, but to be understanding neighbors, to share our own story patiently, and to listen, giving them time and the freedom to decide when and ever are they going to take the next step. So there's some thoughts about seekers, and I hope that was a little bit helpful to you, and I think we might have coffee afterwards, and we can continue the conversation over coffee. How does that sound? We're okay? Went a little bit long here, sorry. Yammered on too much.